God utilizes a variety of methods in the process of teaching His children, of instructing those who are to be in His family in eternity. The technique that He uses when He wants to deeply impress the seriousness of a topic is to first of all lay the foundation at the very beginning of His Word, then establish its impact with examples through the unfolding of His revelation after beginning in the book of Genesis, and finally reveal His final verdict, His final judgment on that topic at the conclusion of the Holy Scriptures. In Genesis chapters 2 and 3, I won't go through and read this material, but we find in these two chapters that God introduces us to the lesson of the two trees. We must obey God. That's the lesson. We must obey God and not try to determine for ourselves what is good and what is evil. That is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the choice that man made. But God says the important thing is to listen to Him, because you're going to get hurt if you try to find out the difference between good and evil on your own. And we can look at the world today, the insanity that is all around us, no matter where we go on the face of this planet. This is the result of man choosing to disobey God, to reject Him, and go the way that we're shown here in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. Because rebellion against God, disobedience to Him, leads to death. That's the point that's being made in chapter 3 in particular. We move on then to chapter 6. In fact, chapter 6, 7, and 8, we have the story of Noah. And in this material, as in chapter 3, we're again shown that the result of humanity rejecting God's way and choosing to go its own way is death. That's the result. It's going to be death. There's no other end product if we decide to do it on our own and reject God. We come to chapter 10. This, of course, is after the flood has receded. A couple of generations, a couple of centuries have gone. We've had a population of the earth is beginning to regenerate. And in chapters 10 and 11, we find recorded that due to the influence of an individual named Nimrod, mankind, just as before the flood, which brought on the flood, mankind again rebelled against God. Thanks, God, but no thanks. We're going to do it our way. And Nimrod was the one that led the people in that direction. Note here in chapter 10, verse 8, Genesis 10:8, we read that Cush begat Nimrod. Now this word Nimrod, this name or title Nimrod, comes from the Hebrew word marad. Marad. And it means literally a rebel. All right, so God named Nimrod what he was. He was the rebel. He was the one who rebelled against God and led humanity in a rebellion against God after the flood. So Cush begat Nimrod, the rebel. He, Nimrod, began to be a mighty one. Now, the Hebrew word translated mighty one here is Gabor. Gabor, and it means, one of the meanings is a tyrant. A tyrant. So he was a mighty one, all right. He took the mightiness or whatever, called himself almighty, and he became a tyrant. He ruled over, with his executive orders and whatever else he may have done back in that day and time. He was a tyrant, clear and simple. So he became a mighty one, a tyrant on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before, this word before is translated from the Hebrew word panim. Panim. Panim means in place of or in front of. If something is before, it's in front of. And so we're talking about in place of God. He became a mighty hunter before or in place of, in front of. He placed himself in front of God. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, the rebel, the mighty hunter in place of, or who has placed himself in front of the Lord. Verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or as the Tanakh and a few other translations have here, Babylon. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, and then Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. After the flood, Nimrod, the rebel, promoted himself as a god and introduced the religion. We don't have time to go back into the earlier details prior to the flood, but he reintroduced to the world the religion of Cain. Cain established a religion prior to the flood. History records the progression of events regarding the life of Nimrod and the religious system that originated with him after the flood. In the conclusion of his revelation, God the Almighty describes, back here in Revelation chapter 17, this religious system that was established by Nimrod, whose kingdom began at Babylon, as Babylon the Great. Note here, Revelation 17, verse 1. Then, John writes, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. That is, this harlot, which symbolizes a religion, has permeated every level of society throughout earth. That's what it says. The kings of the earth, all the inhabitants of the earth are made drunk. So all have been influenced or affected by this particular religion. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, verse 3, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this woman, this religion, it says, was full of names of blasphemy. That is, things that were anti-God. Anything that is blasphemous is anti-God. And so here is a system, a religious system, that is anti the true Creator, the Almighty God. Verse 4, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And so she is royalty, if you will. Look how she's dressed. She's royalty. She's looked up to. This religion is in the world. And, verse 5, on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. The mother, this is the one, the religion that gave rise to many others that are similar. They are all, if they direct any people away from God, whether it's, Christian, Islam, whatever, if it directs people away from God, it is a blasphemous system. It is a blasphemous religion. And she's the mother. It started with her. And that woman started with Nimrod right after the flood. God tells us that He never forgets the sins of those who follow the Babylonian system, unless, of course, they repent and come out of that system. And that's what we're told here in chapter 18 of Revelation, beginning in verse 1. John, the Apostle John, goes on to tell us here, after these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority. And the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. That is, this system that began with Nimrod, God is going to destroy. Has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people. This is coming from heaven, so this is God speaking, relaying a message through angels. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed, mix double for her. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine. And she will be utterly burned with fire, that is destroyed forever. For strong is the Lord God who judges her. So we find that the Bible begins and the Bible ends with warnings against following the false religious system which has dominated the world, that is, the post-flood world, since the time of Nimrod's Babylon. Since this system that God describes here began immediately after the flood, and it isn't destroyed. All right, it goes all the way back to the flood, all the way back to Nimrod, who was born after the flood. So from Nimrod's day, after the flood, from then until now, it's not destroyed, God says, until the end of the age, which we haven't quite gotten to. The end isn't here right now. We're right at the door, the threshold of the end, but we haven't gotten to the end, because in the end, all is going to be made right. Therefore, this religious system must now, at this very time, be in existence, exerting influence upon the whole world, which includes us, because we live in this world. We are influenced by this system. Understanding, brethren, this extremely important truth, we must ask ourselves, are we aware of and keeping ourselves free from the influence of Babylon, the influence of Nimrod's religion? Or are we foolishly flirting with this system? Where are we? Those are serious questions that we need to ask, because we just read in Revelation 18 what happens to those who don't come out of it. Death and destruction. Since we're now in the most heavily promoted holiday season of the year for this world, it's a good time to remind ourselves of the dangers of becoming involved with the Babylonian system. It's also a good time to analyze our own lives personally to determine just how much we may be influenced by the Babylonian system, so that we ourselves can see what changes we must make in order to avoid these plagues, which are soon to come upon all of those who are a part of that anti-God system, no matter which religion, whether the mother or one of her daughters. Because it's going to come. God is very clear. The idolatry connected with Babylon the Great reaches so deeply into the lives of those who profess to be Christians in the world today, and it's done through festivals, such as this particular season of the year. This is not a season that God tells us to observe. This is a season that the world observes, the Christmas season, the Easter season. Okay? The world observes those. And that's how the idolatry gets inbred, is through festivals. Also through doctrines such as the Trinity, which closes off the family of God, and the immortal soul, which gives people the concept that you go on forever and just whatever. Maybe not in this form, and that is a blasphemous lie as well. But through those doctrines, people get pulled into this idolatrous system, as well as through the use of idolatrous symbols such as the cross. We'll discuss a few of these today, and more importantly, we'll be shown by the Holy Scriptures how wrong it is to become involved in any of these practices, whether it's accepting the doctrines, participating in the holidays, the festivals of this world, or using its symbols. First of all, we need to briefly review the beginning of the system. There's more that we can find out about this system outside the Bible because of archaeology, various discoveries that have been made, records that have been kept since the flood. So there are a number of ways that we can find out more of exactly what happened in the days of Nimrod. First of all, as the Bible says in Genesis chapter 10, Nimrod established his kingdom, and he began it at Babylon. He is said to have married his own mother, Semiramis. After Nimrod's death, he was killed by Shem, one of the sons of Noah. But after he was put to death, Semiramis claimed that Nimrod was immortal, and that her son, Tammuz, who she gave birth to, was actually the reincarnation of Nimrod. She claimed that a full-grown evergreen tree sprang up overnight from a dead tree stump, and that symbolized, according to Semiramis, the dead Nimrod receiving new life. And so he came back. His immortal soul, of course, re-entered through Tammuz, and so he has come back again. On each anniversary of the day of his rebirth, she claimed Nimrod would visit that evergreen tree from which he sprang up and leave gifts on that tree. And it just so happens that December 25th, on the calendar that's used today, was the day of Nimrod's reincarnation as Tammuz. Semiramis, then, the mother and wife of Nimrod, became the Babylonian Queen of Heaven. That's what she was termed, the Queen of Heaven. And Nimrod, under various names, became known as the Divine Son of Heaven. Through time, Nimrod became known as the sun god, or Baal, or Baal, depending upon your translation and how you pronounce it. He and his mother, Semiramis, became known in various parts of the world: Egypt, Isis, and Osiris. Then you had Cybele and Attis, and on it goes. I guess Woden and Freya. I mean, you look all around the world and you see this mother-child, mother-son relationship, and it all goes back to Nimrod and Semiramis. Symbols became connected with the worship of the heavens and worship of things relating especially to fertility and sex. It was rampant in the ancient world. The sun, moon, stars, all were symbolic. Bulls or calves, eggs, fish, rabbits, crosses, wreaths, you name it. I mean, all kinds of symbols that are used in this world to, again, focus back. I mean, they all originated with sex and the worship of sex, the worship of fertility. The worship of Baal had a distinctly negative and disastrous effect on the Old Testament church. And by Old Testament church, I mean Israel. Throughout its history, let's go back to Ezekiel chapter 20. Throughout its history, ancient Israel almost always had a problem with idolatry. Moses battled the problem virtually from the first moment he interacted with Israel. Now, we're not given a lot of that information back in the book of Exodus when Moses goes. Rather, Ezekiel tells us a little bit about this problem that Moses ran up against. Ezekiel 20, beginning in verse 5. And Moses was told to go to Israel. I'm not going to go through all of that, but we'll read here what God tells Ezekiel to tell Israel. Say to them, thus says the Lord God, on the day when I chose Israel and raised my hand in an oath to the descendants of the house of Jacob and made myself known to them, note where, in the land of Egypt. Moses was the one that came and introduced God to them. But the day, he says, I did that, I raised my hand in an oath to them, saying, I am the Lord your God. On that day, verse 6 goes on, I raised my hand in an oath to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt, into a land that I had searched out for them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands. Then I said to them, after he had sworn this oath that he's going to bring them out of Egypt, I said to them, each of you, note what his requirement was, throw away the abominations which are before his eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. Throw them away. I am the Lord your God. But God says. They rebelled against me and would not obey me. They did not all cast away the abominations which were before their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. They continued on despite the oath that God made, the promise of rescuing them from their Egyptian captivity. Then I said, I will pour out my fury upon them, or on them, and fulfill my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. And then God proceeded to pour out the first 3 plagues upon Israel as well as the Egyptians. And then, beginning with the 4th plague, he no longer, in order to make a distinction between the people that he'd made a promise and swore an oath to, and the difference between them and the Egyptians, he did not require Israel to suffer any more of the plagues. But he didn't get the idolatry out of them. It was still there. Because immediately after they leave Egypt and then they make their trip, they get up just a few months later to the place at Sinai where God makes a covenant with them, we find that immediately after Moses goes up for 40 days and nights to commune with God and to receive the tablets that God carved with his own hands, God, the incident of the golden calf, Moses comes back and here's the golden calf. Well, God reiterated at that time the need to remove all idols and reminders of other gods. Exodus 34, verse 12. Exodus 34, verse 12. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars. Don't leave them standing, as memorials to the people who were here before you. No, you don't leave them around. You get rid of them. You destroy them. Lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars or images, King James has, and cut down their wooden images, or as the King James better has, groves. And cut down their groves. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. So, Israel had a problem with idolatry. And that idolatry goes right back to Nimrod. It all goes back to Nimrod. They had a problem with it in Egypt because Osiris and Isis were worshipped in Egypt. So there was a problem there. Then there was a problem after they came out of Egypt. They still clung to idolatry. Oh, Aaron, make us a calf. Make us a calf to lead us back to Egypt. And so they still had a problem with idolatry. And they worshiped the images in the groves. What exactly were the images? What were the groves that God wanted to be destroyed? First, we need to understand the meaning of the terms. Since the meanings are very similar in both the Hebrew and Greek words that are translated idol and image, I'll only use the definitions from the Greek, since the Greek seems to more thoroughly define the meaning in the Greek lexicons. The Hebrew doesn't go as far in describing what idols and images are. In the Greek-English lexicon by Louw-Nida on page 65, under the word idol, it says, Eidolon, an object which resembles a person, animal, god, and so forth, and which is an object of worship. All right, that's one way Eidolon, which is the Greek word for idol, can be understood. Goes on, the technical distinction between an image and an idol is that an image may merely represent a supernatural being, while an idol not only represents such a being, but note this, that idol is believed to possess certain inherent supernatural powers. So it's more than just a physical representation. It's something physical that has supernatural powers. This is the way the meaning is. Images, it goes on, often become idols when they are assumed to possess such powers in and of themselves rather than being mere representations of some supernatural entity. Now, under the topic of image in the Louan-Nida, the word icon is translated image in the English. Icon, an object not necessarily three-dimensional, which has been formed to resemble a person, God, animal, etc. Okay? Those are the definitions there for idol and image in the Louan-Nida. In Vine's Expository Dictionary on page 583, under idol, it says eidolon, primarily a phantom or likeness, or an idea, fancy, denotes in the New Testament an idol, an image to represent a false god, or the false god worshipped in an image. All right, so that's the terminology. That's what God said get rid of. Get rid of all these things because I am the only God. So don't put anything out there that even resembles something that is going to replace me in your thinking. But what about the grove? What about the grove? The grove. I'll go to some outside sources here on this, or an outside source. The Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, which is a compilation of incredible volumes of material from books that were written 200, 300, 400 years ago, and very interesting. Barbara Walker is was the editor, I think. 1983, it was published on page 356 under Grove. Fairly lengthy article on grove here. It says, next to a cave, a grove was the most popular uterine symbol, getting back to fertility and sex, uterine symbol in ancient religions, even among early Semites to whom Asherah was the mother goddess of the grove. Asherah represented Semiramis. She was the goddess of the grove. A large tree, pillar, or obelisk within the grove often represented the male god inside the goddess as both child and lover. Again, you see, it goes right back to Semiramis, right back to Nimrod, right back to Babylon. God cautioned the Old Testament church against even the slightest defilement from groves. Notice here in Deuteronomy chapter 16, Deuteronomy 16 and in verse 20. Now remember, Deuteronomy was written by Moses, and this information was passed on to the children of Israel by Moses before he was to leave, go up on Mount Nebo, die, and then God took care of burying him wherever he wanted to place him. So this was a reaffirmation of a covenant that was being made in the book of Deuteronomy. It says, you shall follow, verse 20, you shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not plant for yourself, note this, you shall not plant for yourself any tree as a wooden image, or the King James has, you shall not plant any tree as a grove, or you shall not plant a grove of any trees. Do not do that. Do not copy what was being done in the land before you came. The New International translates grove as any wooden Asherah pole. Don't plant a grove of trees near the altar which you build for yourself to the Lord your God. You shall not set up a sacred pillar which the Lord your God hates. So God says, don't even think about planting a grove anywhere close to an altar because it's too similar to Nimrod's religion. It's too similar to the Babylonian religion. You stay away from that. Do not do it under any circumstance. Maybe you're thinking what you're doing is okay, planting a few trees. Not a grove. You don't plant this circle. You don't do the things that the heathen have done. And so God cautioned them. However, the Old Testament church was transgressing this commandment shortly after the death of Joshua. Back in Judges chapter 2. Judges 2, beginning in verse 11. Judges 2, verse 11. It says, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals, or the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And the Ashtoreths were always connected to the groves. So they got right back into it, which Joshua told them they would before he died. You're going to do this. And when the elders that outlived Joshua were gone, that's exactly what they did. They went back and did exactly what the people around them were doing. Well, it's okay. It's all right. Grandma did it. Grandpa did it. And, Grandma and Grandpa did it. So it's okay. It's okay for us because we're putting God into this. God says, you know what? You can't put me in any kind of symbolic whatever that was done on the behalf of idols. And yet people have rationalized and rationalized. Solomon, as time progressed and we come to the time of the kings, neither Saul nor David seem to have participated in this, but when we come to Solomon, and when Solomon became king, he went so far as to construct groves on the Mount of Olives. There in Jerusalem, inside of the temple. He built groves on the Mount of Olives. This incredibly wise man. Note here in 1 Kings 11, verse 7. 1 Kings 11, verse 7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is before, or the New King James says, which is east of Jerusalem. Well, he's talking about the Mount of Olives. So he built a high place for Chemosh on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Solomon went that far to build groves, and knowing better. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, continued in his father's sin here in chapter 14 of 1 Kings. 1 Kings 14, verse 22, read from the New International Version. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is after the division of the kingdoms. Rehoboam took the northern 10 tribes, and Rehoboam had the south. So you had Jeroboam in the north, and introducing Israel, the 10 tribes of the north, into blatant idolatry with the 2 calves that he put from one end of the area to the other. And then in the south, Judah did the same. Rehoboam did not learn. And so Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. By the sins they committed, they stirred up that is God's jealous anger, more than their fathers had done. They also set up for themselves high places, sacred stones, and Asherah poles, or the King James again has groves. They set up groves on every high hill and under every spreading tree. There were even male shrine prostitutes in the land, sodomites, as the King James has. They were sodomites. And they were participating in activities supposedly in worshiping God. The people engaged in all the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. God told them He didn't want any of that, but they did it anyway. They went ahead and did exactly what He said not to do, just like Adam and Eve back there in Genesis 2 and 3. They were warned. They did it anyway. Rehoboam's grandson, Asa, here in chapter 15 of 1 Kings, cleared the land of many of the idols, but he did not totally rid the nation of its idolatry. He did a job, but he didn't get it all. We're told here in verse 9 of 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 9, the New International again, in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa became king of Judah. And he reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. His grandmother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father, which would, going back a little bit, his forefather David had done. He expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his fathers had made. He even deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive Asherah pole, or the King James says she made an idol in a grove. So he had to take action with his grandmother. Asa cut the pole down and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Although he did not remove the high places, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. And so we find at least there was a king now and then that attempted to set things right and to try to obey God. Ultimately, the northern kingdom that rebelled against Rehoboam, the northern kingdom was eventually taken into Assyrian captivity because of their idolatry, which led them to cut themselves off from God. In 2 Kings chapter 17, beginning in verse 6, we read about what happened and why. Why God did this. In the 9th year of Hoshea, who was king of Israel, the final king of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria, and placed them in Halah and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods, and had walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel which they had made. Also, the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right. And they built for themselves high places in all their cities. That's gone on today. They're high. If you don't have a hill, then you just build a building high enough that you can put a steeple on, and you got a high place so you can advertise, your God or whatever that you worship. And so they built, it says here, they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images, or images and groves, King James has, on every high hill and under every green tree. There they burned incense on all the high places like the nations whom the Lord had carried away before them. And they did wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger, for they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this thing." Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I commanded your fathers and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets." Nevertheless, they would not hear, but stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he had testified against them. They followed idols, became idolaters, and went after the nations who were all around them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. Doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. God told Israel, and he tells us. Doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. Doesn't make it right. Verse 16, so they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, or the King James says they made a grove, and they worshiped all the host of heaven and served Baal. They caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire, practiced witchcraft and soothsaying, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. So all of the northern kingdom was expunged, taken out of the land. And that left only the southern kingdom of Judah. Verse 24, I'll read from the New International, says, the king of Assyria, this is after the northern 10 tribes were removed, what was left of them anyway. A lot of them had already migrated and left the area during the time of the severe drought. But what was left? They went off into Assyrian exile. We find in verse 24 then, because of the fact the land was pretty well unpopulated, and the Assyrians didn't want somebody else coming in there and messing things up and rebelling against them, they brought people, it says here, from Babylon, from Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria. That is, Samaria stood for all of the northern kingdom, the area of the northern 10 tribes. So they were settled in all of that area to replace the Israelites. The people that were brought in from Babylon, I wonder what religion, let's see, they came from Babylon. What religion would they have brought? You can count on it being a blasphemous religion, an abominable religion, because they came from Babylon. Okay, so they came and they settled. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship, or the New King James says, they did not fear the Lord. So he, the Lord, sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, the people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off because the people do not know what he requires. Or the New King James has, the people do not know the rituals of the God of the land. And again, that was their concept. The God that was over a particular area was whoever the God was that looked down from the high place. And that was his territory. And they didn't know who that God was. So, if you can just help them see who they should be worshiping, what name they should call him, then, these lions will quit coming and devouring the people. Verse 33, they sent individuals in to teach them. And in verse 33, they worshiped then the Lord. But they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. So they brought with them their own customs, but yet they were giving lip service, at least using the name of the God of Israel. Verse 44, even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their fathers did. Whoever it was, whether it was Ezra or whoever that edited this, and probably was, this material, that's who did it. They were continuing to do this. They syncretized their idolatrous religion, which they brought from Babylon or some of these other towns mentioned back up here in verse 24. They began using their own idolatrous religion, connecting it with the name of the being that Israel had claimed that they were worshiping while they were in the land. Now, they weren't worshiping the God of Israel. They were worshiping idols. But they still used God's name. Let's put God's name to it. Because, after all, he was the God that was controlling all of this territory. They looked at God like they look at Baal, Zephon, Baal, Zippor, all the various Baals here and there. In order to gain pagan converts, this is centuries later, before the death of the Apostle John, we move forward in time, and in order to gain pagan converts, the counterfeit Christian church, founded on the Babylonian mystery system of Nimrod, began syncretizing the teachings of Jesus with the religions of the pagans. Part of that amalgamation involved the retention of pagan days and methods of worship including pagan symbols. What began in the 1st century A.D., in the days prior to the death of John, toward the end of the 1st century, that eventually culminated in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries when the leaders of the counterfeit Christian church officially, they had a synod, and they officially rejected the Holy Scriptures, at least the authority of the Holy Scriptures, because they substituted what the Bible said you should do with the religion of Nimrod. And that's what we have today. In the book, The Christian Mystery and the Pagan Mysteries, Hugo Rayner, on page 152, writes, "The church fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries," that's the church fathers of the Catholic Church, "borrowed words, images, and gestures," which means the rituals and ceremonies, "from the mysteries," that is, the Babylonian mysteries. They borrowed directly from paganism. What they borrowed was not the substance, but a dress wherein to display it. Or, as Clement of Alexandria couched it in our motto, quote, "I shall explain the mysteries of the Logos," Jesus, "in images that are known to you. I'll explain Him based upon the pagan gods that you've worshipped." In The Golden Bough, a study in magic and religion by Sir James Fraser, was written in 1922. I have the abridged edition, which was printed in 1960. On on the bottom of page 416 and up to the top part of page 417. What considerations led the ecclesiastical authorities, he's talking about of the Catholic Church, to institute the festival of Christmas? What led them to do this? Because it's not in the Bible. What led them to do this? The motives for the innovation are stated with great frankness by a Syrian writer, himself a Christian. The reason, he tells us, why the fathers transferred the celebration of the 6th of January to the 25th of December was this: it was a custom of the heathen to celebrate on the same 25th of December the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and festivities, the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day, and the festival of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. And it goes on page 417, the heathen origin of Christmas. Fraser brings it right out. The heathen origin, because it does not have origin in the Scripture. The heathen origin of Christmas is plainly hinted at, if not tacitly admitted, by Augustine when he exhorts his Christian brethren not to celebrate that solemn day like the heathen on account of the sun, S-U-N, but on account of Him who made the sun. So, there was a deliberate bringing in or syncretization of the Babylonian mystery religion with what the world today has deemed Christianity. Christianity is not Christian. It is not following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. It is following in the footsteps of Nimrod. The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, page 93, says, within the Christian church, no such festival as Christmas was ever heard of till the 3rd century, and that not till the 4th century was far advanced did it gain much observance. How then did the Romish church fix on December the 25th as Christmas Day? Why thus? Long before the 4th century and long before the Christian era itself, a festival was celebrated among the heathen at that precise time of the year, in honor of the birth of the son of the Babylonian queen of heaven, Semiramis. In order to conciliate the heathen and to swell the number of the nominal adherents of Christianity, the same festival was adopted by the Roman Church, giving it only the name of Christ. Skipping down a little bit, it says, that Christmas was originally a pagan festival is beyond all doubt. The time of year and the ceremonies with which it is still celebrated prove its origin. In Egypt, the son of Isis, the Egyptian title for the Queen of Heaven, was born at this very time, about the time of the winter solstice, December 25th. We already covered that. Goes on here on page 99, kind of an addition to the Christmas festive season, kissing under the mistletoe bough. That mistletoe bough on the in the Druidic superstition, which as we have seen was derived from Babylon, was a representation of the Messiah, the man, the branch. The mistletoe was regarded as a divine branch, a branch that came from heaven and grew upon a tree that sprang out of the earth. Okay, getting back to what Semiramis said after Shem killed Nimrod and what happened with this tree springing up and so forth and so on. Thus, by the ingrafting of the celestial branch into the earthly tree, heaven and earth, that sin had severed, were joined together. And thus the mistletoe bough became the token of divine reconciliation to man, the kiss being the well-known token of pardon and reconciliation. And so many more things we could cover about the Christmas whatever, but various customs, and they all go right back to this. Now, not only did the Old Testament church make groves against God's instruction, they also made models or images of those groves, which they could transport from place to place. So they could set them up wherever they desired. Manasseh, King Manasseh of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, actually took one of these models of the grove into the temple itself. We're told here in 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 7. 2 Kings 21, verse 7, the New International renders this. He, Manasseh, took the carved Asherah pole, King James has, took the graven image of the grove he had made and put it in the temple. Of all things, not just outside the temple, it was placed inside the temple, a grove. That thing which God hated. Now, Josiah came along and corrected the problems that his father Ammon and his grandfather Manasseh brought on. Here in 2 Kings 23 and verse 4, and the king, that is King Josiah, commanded Hilkiah the high priest, the priests of the second order, and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the articles that were made for Baal, for Asherah, or for the grove, the King James has, for the grove, and for all the host of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. Then he removed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense on the high places in the cities of Judah and in the places all around Jerusalem, and those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the host of heaven. Doesn't sound like God's too thrilled with astrology here either. We'll just throw that in there because astrology is the worship of constellations and the demons associated with that. Verse 6, and he brought out the wooden image, or the grove, from the house of the Lord, that is from the temple, to the brook Kidron outside Jerusalem, burned it, that is the image that Manasseh took into the temple. He burned it at the brook Kidron and ground it to ashes and threw its ashes on the graves of the common people. Then He tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons, or the sodomites, again as the King James has, that were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the wooden image, or they wove hangings for the grove, the King James says. All of that stuff taking place right there at the temple. All of this paganism brought right to the temple, which was to represent the presence of God among the people. Now, what exactly was this image or model of the grove? If we keep in mind the story of Nimrod Baal, we can begin to see from historical as well as archaeological evidence just what this model of the grove was, just what that image was and still is. In the book Secret Teachings of All Ages, written by Manly Hall in 1901, on page 36, says, in Phrygia, there existed a remarkable school of religious philosophy which centered around the life of Attis, or Adonis, as we know the Greek god being. This deity was born at midnight on the 25th day of December. What a coincidence. You know, there's so many coincidences here. It's just amazing. Of his death, he emasculated himself under a pine tree and there died. That's how Adonis supposedly died. Nimrod, again, was killed by Shem and hacked to pieces in parts of his body, sent here, there, and wherever, so that everybody knew that Nimrod was dead. But anyway, this is Adonis. This is kind of a little takeoff. So he emasculated himself under a pine tree, there died. To the rites of Attis, or Adonis, the modern world is indebted for the symbol of the Christmas tree. Attis imparted his immortality to the tree beneath which he died. And Cybele, his mother, which again refers back to Semiramis, took the tree with her when she removed the body. Attis remained 3 days in the tomb, according to, again, the teaching that Satan was able to, weave into the whole story, and rose upon a date corresponding to Easter morn. Well, of all things. In the mysteries of the Phrygians, every year a pine tree is cut down, and inside of the tree the image of a youth is tied in. The middle of the trunk is nicely hollowed out. The idol of Osiris made from those hollowed pieces is buried. In the rituals of the Kabiri is to be traced a form of pine tree worship. For this tree, sacred to Attis, or Adonis, was first trimmed into the form of a cross, and then cut down in honor of the murdered god whose body was discovered at its foot. Skipping on down to page 95 in Secret Teaching, it says, the mystery of the evergreen marking the grave of the dead sun god is also perpetuated in the Christmas tree. In Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, page 166, trappings such as Yule logs, gifts, lights, mistletoe, holly, which generally are in wreaths. The wreaths were all made out of green because green, is living things. Mistletoe stays green through the winter, and so they would get all of this because the sun's coming down, it's getting to dark. Let's have the green stuff because we want life again. And so green wreaths made out of holly, made even out of mistletoe and pines or other evergreen trees. Carols, that is, going around and singing, feasts and processions were altogether pagan. They were drawn from the worship of the goddess as mother of the divine child. Christmas trees evolved from pine groves attached to temples of the Great Mother. On the night before a holy day, Roman priests called dendrophori, or tree bearers, dendre meaning tree, phori being bearer, cut one of the sacred pines, decorated it, and carried it into the temple to receive the effigy of Attis. Remember, they have to cut it open, hollow it out, and put the image in. That was the way the worship of Attis or Adonis was done. Now, as we've seen here in what these records tell us, tree worship also took the form of worshiping a cross, okay, because the cross was originated by cutting the tree and leaving, it in a certain way, or cutting and having just an upright stake and then putting a cross piece on it to make the cross that represented the grove. In Secret Teachings of All Ages, on page 23, it says, both the cross and the serpent were sacred to the Druids, who made the former by cutting off all the branches of an oak tree and fastening one, that is one of those branches, to the main trunk in the form of the letter T. This oaken cross became symbolic of their superior deity. Now, this is what the Druids did. The Druids have their origin in the northern kingdom of ancient Israel. And they moved from there because they were taken out. Some of them went on their own and went up into the area of Western Europe and into the British Isles. On page 144 of Secret Teachings, it says the fundamental symbols of the Rosicrucians were the rose and the cross. The rose female and the cross male, both universal phallic emblems. Page 181. The prevalent idea that the reverence for the cross is limited to the Christian world is disproved by even the most superficial investigation of its place in religious symbolism. The early Christians used every means possible to conceal, note, to conceal the pagan origin of their symbols, doctrines, and rituals. They knew they were pagan, and they tried to cover it up to the best of their ability. Not only, rituals. It says the ancient world more clearly understood the continuity of the pagan mysteries in Christianity. Not only is the cross itself a familiar object in the art of all nations, but the veneration for it, for the cross, is an essential part of the religious life of the greater part of humanity. That's the reason they found crosses all over North America when explorers were coming. Well, somebody's already brought the gospel to North America. No, these crosses are there because of pagan worship. They go back to Nimrod. When people were taken by Noah here, there, and wherever, the people who were there with Nimrod took the symbols of Nimrod. That's how the crosses got here. Got, all over the world. And you find crosses everywhere because all of humanity after the flood left the area of the Tower of Babel where Nimrod had already indoctrinated them. The cross, again, owes its widespread use to the central role that it held in the Babylonian mystery religion begun by Nimrod. In the book The Sacred Fire, the story of sex and religion by B.Z. Goldberg, published in 1930 on page 97, says primitive man was greatly occupied with his own organs of reproduction. They became for him the symbols of generation in the universe. Not only were these organs themselves symbolic, but anything suggesting them became emblems of the generative divinities. The male organ is in the symbol, or is in the shape of a rod with a round head, so any object of this form, stone or wood, might become such a symbol. And of course we have a great big one right there, in the between the Lincoln Memorial and the Senate building and back behind the White House. There's a gigantic one there. They've just refurbished it and made it shinier and newer and whatever. And so that's what it is. It is a symbol of that. The female organ is an oval opening, so any oval figure might represent the female divinity of sex. By further simplification, it was enough to draw a vertical line to suggest the male organ and a horizontal one to signify the female, while the union of the two was represented by, that's right, the cross. In the book The Celtic Druids by Godfrey Higgins, it was written in 1829, on page 130, having shown that the cross was in common use long before the time of Christ. Now, I don't have the other part of this. I duplicated this 40, 35 years ago, whatever, and I didn't get the earlier pages. I need to buy the book if I can find it. But anyway, earlier in the book, he did say stuff, and but this I felt was the most pertinent thing back when copies were 25 cents a piece. That was horribly expensive. So I was cheapskate rather than, man, I could kick myself for not duplicating more stuff. But anyway, having shown that the cross was in common use long before the time of Christ by the continental nations of the world, it is now only necessary to show that it was equally in use by the Druids of Britain to overthrow the arguments used to prove certain monuments Christian from the circumstance alone of their bearing the figure of the cross. He goes on to say, the adoration of the cross has been more general in the world than that of any other emblem. It is curious to observe how the cross is regaining its old place in this country, like it was when it was all pagan, when it was the Druids doing. This guy's writing in the early 1800s. And you go back, and it wasn't that widely used because the church, at least those who understood, tried to live by the Bible, they didn't want anything to do with it. So he says, it is curious to observe how the cross is regaining its old place in this country. 100 years ago, our Protestant females would have been shocked at the idea of wearing a cross. They'd have been shocked. And when you go to the British Museum and you see right there in front of you these incredible things that archaeologists have pulled out, there is no just surmising a symbol. It's the real thing. And so they're, walking around with something there that's a sex symbol. And he says, they would have been shocked 100 years earlier. They would never have done that. Now, early 1800s, they all have crosses dangling from their necks, and our priests generally prevail to have it elevated on the tops of our new churches. And of course, we've seen that. You look around, especially down south, everywhere you look, there's a white church with a steeple and a big cross on top symbolizing the grove. And a grove, of course, symbolizes, as we saw in the sacred fire, something else. The Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, page 188. But long before the Christian era, it was a pagan religious symbol throughout Europe and Western Asia. Early Christians even repudiated the cross because it was pagan. A church father of the 3rd century, Minucius Felix, indignantly denied that Christians worship the cross. You it is, ye pagans, who are the most likely people to adore wooded crosses. So, it wasn't until the late 3rd century before, the late 3rd century before people finally began doing some of the things that they've gone back to now. The cross was also a male symbol of the phallic tree of life. Therefore, it often appeared in conjunction with the female genital circle or oval to signify the sacred marriage. Male genitals are still called the tree of life by the Arabs, and a cross was one of the oldest diagrammatic images of male genitals. So that's what it's all about. We saw earlier, back in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 20, that God even prohibited the planting of any trees anywhere close to the place where He was going to be worshiped to prevent any temptation to copy the religious system of Babylon. Stay away from it. God says don't do anything to even get close to the way they did things. And yet those who call themselves Christians today have no qualms in blatantly using the religious symbols of Babylon. They create, again, their own high places by building steeples on their meeting halls and putting crosses up here, there, and wherever. You know, you don't have a hill, build a high building. Put a big steeple on it. You'll get it up there far enough that people can see. The Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 4, page 530. Catholic doctrine on the veneration of the cross. Okay, Catholics do venerate the cross. Why do they do it? Precisely the same doctrine is repeated in session 25 of the Council of Trent. Images are not to be worshipped because it is believed that some divinity or power resides in them, and that they must be worshipped on that account, or because we ought to ask anything of them, or because we should put our trust in them, as was done by the Gentiles of old who placed their hope in idols. But, okay, why are images to be worshipped? But because the honor which is shown to them is referred to the prototypes which they represent. So that through the images which we kiss and before which we kneel, we may adore Christ and venerate the saints whose semblances they bear. So that's open worship of the cross, which represents the grove. According to this statement, a physical symbol can be worshipped as long as one understands that the honor showed the symbol is actually being received by whatever it represents. So is that acceptable to God? Well, it wasn't acceptable to God when we find that Manasseh put one of these crosses in the temple. He wasn't happy with that. He wasn't happy with Solomon for sticking up groves and high places all over the Mount of Olives for all the pagan gods that his wives worshipped. I'd like to go back to Matthew chapter 5. Let's look at a principle here that Jesus Christ gives us that answers this question of whether it's acceptable for us to use symbols or whatever for the worship of Him. Symbols that came straight out of paganism. Here in Matthew 5, verse 27, Jesus is going through and magnifying the scope of the seventh commandment here. And He says, "You've heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" That is, you're not to participate in the physical act. "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." He says it's more than just physically doing something. It's what's going on in the mind. So just as the seventh commandment here is expanded beyond all physical actions that could be classified as adultery, the second commandment, "You shall have no idols," you're not to make any idols, also should be understood by a true follower of Jesus Christ to require avoidance of anything which even hints at idolatry. So we are to stay completely away from it. Brethren, unlike the Israelites of the Old Testament church, we must be very careful to avoid any defilement from the evil religious system of Babylon. So next time we will go into some other things and analyze just how far-reaching this system has been and how it may be affecting us and what we need to do about that.